And welcome to the Word Encounter, episode 55. We're going to continue in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel. If we recall, at the end of chapter 21, David was acting crazy before the king of Gath because he was afraid of the king of Gath. And so he was acting insane. And the king essentially said, "I've got enough crazy people, get out of here." And so David leaves unharmed. And so in verse 1 of chapter 22, David left Gath and took refuge in a cave. When David's brothers and his father's whole family heard, they went down and joined him there. In addition, every man who was desperate, in debt, or discontented rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. So we see that David's whole family, including his brothers, remember, when David went to the front lines and his brothers were kind of hammering him about him being there, now they're following him. They recognize him as the leader. And so he's got about 400 fighting men with him. And so then David left the cave and he went to Mizpah of Moab to drop off his father and mother and I guess other people who weren't fighting men. And then they went on the lam. They started going around to different places. And in verse 6, it says, Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. And then what happens then is Saul starts lamenting with his men, how come everybody seems to be against me and for David? How come people aren't telling me anything about where he is or anything like that? And so we drop down to verse 9 and it says, Then Doeg the Edomite, who was in charge of Saul's servants, answered, I saw Jesse's son come to Ahimelech's son. I saw Jesse's son come to Ahimelech. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him and gave him provisions. He also gave him the sword of Goliath. Now remember, Ahimelech was the priest that David had gone to and desired bread or food for his troops, and he was the one that told David his men had been consecrated and they hadn't been with a woman, so they were eligible to eat the bread of his presence, which was consecrated. And so Ahimelech gave him the bread. He also gave him Goliath's sword. And so, but remember, David thought he saw somebody that he knew, and it turns out that he did. And so Doeg tells Saul that, yes, I saw him, he gave him some bread, and he gave him a sword. And so then Saul, he summons Ahimelech and his family. He says, come here, I need to talk to you. And so in verse 13, Saul asks him being Ahimelech, why did you and Jesse's son conspire against me? And so Ahimelech is confused. And in verse 14, Ahimelech replied to the king, who among all your servants is as faithful as David? He is the king's son-in-law. He is your son-in-law, Saul, captain of your bodyguard and honored in your house. Was today the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Please don't let the king make an accusation against your servant or any of my father's family. For your servant didn't have any idea about any of this. I didn't know anything about this. Verse 16, but the king said, you will die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family. The king then ordered the guards standing by him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord because they sided with David, for they knew he was fleeing, but they didn't tell me. But the king's servants would not lift a hand to execute the priests of the Lord. So we see here that Saul really doesn't have a tight grip on his servants, and I think, through all of this, that they must have been observing some flaws in Saul and maybe even recognizing that he maybe is not the legitimate king. It says in verse 18, so the king said to Doeg, go and execute the priests. So Doeg the Edomite went and executed the priests himself. On that day, he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. He also struck down Nob, the city of the priests, with the sword, both men and women, infants, and nursing babies, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. And so he killed all the men that came with Ahimelech to Saul. Then he went to Nob and put the whole city to the sword. However, it says in verse 20, one of the sons of Ahimelech escaped. His name was Abiathar, and he fled to David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, I knew Doeg the Edomite was there that day, and that he was sure to report Saul. I myself am responsible for the lives of everyone in your father's family. So when David had gone and gotten the food or gotten the bread and the sword for Ahimelech, he knew he recognized Doeg, but he wasn't sure. But he, in his subconscious, he knew that was him, and so he was feeling guilty that the whole town of Nob was put to the sword. So we move on to chapter 23, and it says, it was reported to David, look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and raiding the threshing floors. And so Keilah is a city in Judah. And so David inquires of the Lord, should I launch an attack against these Philistines? And the Lord says, launch an attack. And so they go to Keilah in order to fight their battle. And then we see that in verse 7, when it was reported to Saul that David had gone to Keilah, he said, God has handed him over to me, for he has trapped himself by entering the town with barred gates. And so David inquires of the Lord, should we go? He says, yes, go fight my battle. Saul sees this as the Lord delivering David to him. So two different perspectives from the same event. And so David gets word that Saul knows that he's in Keilah and Saul is coming and whatnot. And so David again inquires of the Lord. We see that David is always inquiring of the Lord. Saul didn't do this. David is always inquiring of the Lord before he acts. And so in verse 12, David asks, will the citizens of Keilah hand me over to them? Will the citizens of Keilah hand me and my men over to Saul? They will, the Lord responded. So David and his men, numbering about 600, left Keilah at once and moved from place to place. And so the Lord is protecting him, watching over him, because David is inquiring. There's a lesson here. Anyway, so David inquires. He said, yes, the citizens will hand you over. So now David and his men start moving from place to place to evade Saul. And the word says that Saul searched for him every day, but God did not hand David over to him. So this was a daily thing. They would move. They kept moving around the land and the territory. Saul kept trying to find him, couldn't find him. So somehow Jonathan gets word of where he is. And in verse 16, it says, and so remember, Jonathan is Saul's son, but David and Jonathan are great friends. And so in verse 16, it says, then Saul's son Jonathan came to David in Horesh and encouraged him in his faith in God. So he came along and was giving him encouragement. He knew he was on the lam running away from his father, but he came to encourage him. In verse 17, it says, Jonathan said, don't be afraid, for my father Saul will never lay a hand on you. You yourself will be king over Israel, and I'll be your second in command. Even my father Saul knows this to be true. So he's saying, even my dad knows that you're going to be king, and I know that you're going to be king, and I'm going to be your second. And so he's encouraging David with his prophetic word, basically. And so then, he leaves, and then Saul is still in pursuit of David. David is staying just ahead of Saul and whatnot. Then Saul gets word that the Philistines are attacking one of our towns. So Saul breaks off pursuit and goes to fight for that town, city, or whatever, and then comes back and picks up his pursuit of David again. And then it says in chapter 24 in verse 3, when Saul came to the sheep pens along the road, a cave was there, and he went to relieve himself. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. So Saul is going in this cave, but David and his men are inside this cave. Now, I think this is probably a pretty big cave. Okay. In verse 4, so his men said to him, look, this is the day the Lord told you about. I will hand your enemy over to you so you can do to him whatever you desire. Then David got up and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. In verse 5, afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Now, remember, David had this intimate, close relationship with God. They're communing all the time. And he knows that Saul was the Lord's anointed. And so he doesn't want to raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. And so this is really bothering him. And it says in verse 6, he said to his men, I swear before the Lord, I would never do such a thing to my Lord. In other words, I swear before God, I would never do such a thing to my Lord, speaking about Saul. I would never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against the Lord's anointed, Saul, because God anointed him, is what he's saying. With these words, David persuaded his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. So Saul was still in the cave, and he's telling his guys, don't bother him. Even though he's pursuing us, even though we're on the run, don't mess with him. And so Saul leaves the cave and is headed back to his men. In verse 9, the word says, God said to Saul, David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of people who say, look, David intends to harm you? Verse 10, you can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, I won't lift my hand against the Lord, since he's the Lord's anointed. Look, my father, look at the corner of your robe in my hand, for I cut it off, but I didn't kill you. I've got the corner of your robe right here. Look at your robe. See, this is cut off, but I didn't kill you. I could have, but I didn't. In verse 16, it says, when David finished saying these things to him being Saul, Saul replied, is that your voice, David, my son? Then Saul wept aloud and said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have done what is good to me, though I have done what is evil to you. May the Lord repay you with good for what you've done for me today. Now, Saul is an interesting character. I think Saul is kind of like most people because he has these moments of clarity and moments of devotion to the Lord and moments of recognition of the evil that he has done. And he appears to be sincerely remorseful about it. But then he has these other moments where he pays absolutely no attention to any of that and does only the things that are in his best interest. And so he's in and out, up and down. In verse 20, now I know for certain, this is Saul talking, now I know for certain you will be king, and the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. Therefore swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. Verse 22, so David swore to Saul, then Saul went back home, and David and his men went up to the stronghold. And so David swears to Saul, look, I'm not going to wipe you out. I'm not going to wipe out your legacy, your history, or anything like that. And they essentially made a type of covenant agreement. We move on to chapter 25, and it says that Samuel died, and all Israel assembled to mourn for him. David then went into the wilderness of Paran. So apparently all Israel assembled because Samuel died. They came to his funeral. Then David and his men, they went back on the run. And so as they were, on the lam, in verse 3, it says, they came across the land, and they came across this guy who had some territory, and the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. The woman was intelligent and beautiful, but the man, a Calebite, was harsh and evil in his dealings. And so David says, well, he tells some of his guys, go see Nabal and, talk to him, ask him if we can get some food and whatnot, because we protected him when we've been on the land, and he has missed nothing. His crops have been great. Everything's been cool. We protected his land and whatnot. And so they go, and the servants tell Nabal this. And in verse 10, Nabal asked him, who is David? Who is Jesse's son? Many slaves these days are running away from their masters. Am I supposed to take my bread, my water, my meat that I butchered for my shears and give them to these men? I don't know where they are from. And so Nabal he's getting, kind of nasty about it. Well, who is David to come and ask this from me? I'm not going to give you any of my stuff. And so then, so Nabal's servants, they don't like this response because they're the ones that have been in the field. They're the ones that know what David's troops have done for them. So they go tell Abigail, his wife, look, your husband, he's being foolish. He's going to get us all killed, essentially. And so in verse 18, after they tell Abigail, Abigail hurried, taking 200 loaves of bread and some jars of water, some raisins, and she gathered up all this food, put it on, sent some donkeys out and told her servants, go take this to David. In verse 19, then she said to her male servants, go ahead of me. I will be right behind you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. So she didn't tell him that she had done this stuff, but she gathered all his food and put it on the crates and said, go give it to his men. I'll catch up with you. And so she catches up with him, and then she approaches David. And David was just saying to his men what he was going to do to Nabal and his whole household. And then in verse 25, Abigail has approached David, and she tells him, "My lord should pay no attention to this worthless fool Nabal, for he lives up to his name. His name means stupid, and stupidity is all he knows." So this is his wife talking about him. And so she's making an appeal to David. Don't pay him no attention. And she says in verse 27, "Let this gift your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who follow my lord. Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord is certain to make a lasting dynasty for my lord because he fights the Lord's battles." And so again, she's making an appeal. Ignore my husband here. Here's this food. Give it to your servants and do us no harm. Okay, because my husband's a fool. And then she goes and says, "And when the Lord does good things for my lord, may you remember me, your servant." And so again, now Abigail is kind of making a personal appeal. Don't forget about me. In verse 32, then David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you to me today. If you had not come quickly to meet me, Nabal wouldn't have had any males left by morning light." In other words, I would have come and killed everybody before day broke. In verse 35, then David accepted what she had brought him and said, "Go home in peace." And then so Abigail goes back home. And then in verse 37, in the morning when Nabal sobered up, his wife told him about the events. His heart died and he became a stone. Okay, so I guess he kind of went into a coma, if you will. In verse 38, about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal dead. And so now Nabal is dead. And so David gets word that Nabal has died. Then David sent messengers to speak to Abigail about marrying him. So that was kind of quick. And so he sends his messengers. And they tell her, "David sent us to bring you to him as a wife." In verse 41, she stood up, paid homage with her face to the ground, and she said, "Here I am, your servant, a slave to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." So she became his wife. And in verse 43, David also married Ahinoam, and the two of them became his wives. Now remember, David was already married to Michal, but now he's got two other wives. But in verse 44, it says, "But Saul gave his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palti, who was from Galem." And so I don't know how this came about. I don't know, how maybe Saul found out that David married two other women and he gave his daughter away to some. I don't know. But I don't think Saul had the right to do that. I don't know. Anyway, we'll pick this up